And it's pretty obvious that anti-Semitic rhetoric, once it seeps into the mainstream as it's done, then the next step from there becomes physical and verbal assaults on Jews.
I would start with the verbal assaults because we now have to define verbal not only as spoken face to face, but also the written assaults. And especially on social media, that is just rampant. It's actually rampant even between friends and family members who happen to disagree on issues. It's become such a charged atmosphere that violence is no longer just a physical act. We are seeing an immense amount of verbal abuse of Jews, Judaism, Jewish history, Jewish facts, and of course, the manipulation of the Holocaust, which has become even more popularized by the most recent use by public figures, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And so the million-dollar question is essentially, what can be done to prevent this?
I would have to say that first and foremost, we have to stop waiting for more dead Jews before we rally as a people in favor of our rights as the Jewish nation, not only our rights in connection to Israel, but our rights as a nation with an ancestry and an ancient history that binds us to the facts of what we have experienced and what we represent in the world. Unfortunately, what is a Jew has been distorted so much by the anti-Semites. I do believe that not only is education one of the most important tools that are needed to combat the current trend and to prevent its continued growth, but I also think we need to be increasing the empowerment of Jews, young and old, even if they aren't yet faced with the violence of anti-Semitism. This is exactly what we are doing at Israel Forever, and everything that we put out, whether it be informal learning or formal activities, the goal is to empower the Jews to feel proud and to demand the respect that we deserve, that we will not lie down while the hatred continues to rise against us. We will use our voice as virtual citizens of the nation of Israel and even of the state of Israel, and state clearly, we will not let this continue. You will not allow us to be silenced. And whether it is through legal means, educational means, or more importantly, I believe, social means, we have to stand up proudly as what we call Zion proud. Be a part of Am Yisrael and do it in a way that we are building the unity that we speak of so often, but that we are not seeing enough action building towards it.
So you mentioned education is obviously key to combating this.
Israeli politics is dominated by the right wing, with politicians competing on who can be more hawkish when it comes to the Palestinians. So where does that leave Israelis like Miko Peled? He's an anti-Zionist activist, the son of a former Israeli army general, and served in the military himself. I'm Abu Bakr Shamahi, you're watching TRT World, and this is One on One. So Miko, thank you for joining us. We're currently hearing talk about Donald Trump's deal of the century along with Jared Kushner as well. What's the likelihood that Donald Trump is going to be able to bring peace to Israel and Palestine?
Absolutely zero. Not a single chance in the world that Donald Trump can bring peace. The deal of the century is a program that was put together by Benjamin Netanyahu, Jared Kushner, perhaps David Friedman, the American ambassador in Tel Aviv, people who have a single agenda, which is to deprive the Palestinians of their rights, of their land, of their water, of their life.
And is that why Donald Trump perhaps is so popular amongst many Israelis?
Yes, of course. When he came to visit in Jerusalem, I think 2 years ago, I was actually there. And it was a love affair. I've never seen such a love affair. And the reason they loved him so much, this is what they said, it was in the news, it was everywhere. He did not bring a peace plan. He did not bring a program. He had no suggestions, he had no deal. He was just there to tell them they can do whatever they want and be happy.
You know, you've got Netanyahu on one side, you've got Trump on the other side. Netanyahu himself, recently re-elected as Prime Minister, again very popular. What's the secret to his popularity in Israel amongst Israelis?
Well, he's a very smart politician. He knows how to play the game very well. He's got more experience than any other Israeli politician, and he has a list of accomplishments that no Israeli prime minister has ever had. He managed to get the United States to recognize Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel. He managed to get the United States to break out of the deal with Iran. He managed to get the United States to stop funding UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for Refugees, and basically to say there are no refugees. He managed to get the United States to kick out the Palestinian mission, diplomatic mission from Washington, D.C. on the anniversary of the Oslo Agreement, almost the 25th anniversary of the Oslo Agreement, almost to the day is when they closed the mission in Washington, D.C.
Now you've got a big badge on there that says BDS, of course in reference to boycott, divestment, sanctions, the call to boycott Israel. How successful has the BDS movement been?
It's been so successful that in the last presidential elections in the United States, every candidate had to speak up against it. In other words, it's come to a point where it's recognized globally, internationally, as a relevant part of the Palestinian resistance, as the Palestinian fight for justice and freedom and equality.
Now you yourself have been accused of anti-Semitism by some on the pro-Israeli side in the past. You made certain comments on Twitter, for example, I think or saying that Jews perhaps have a reputation for being sleazy thieves. Aren't those kind of comments detrimental for the Palestinian cause when someone like yourself as a Palestinian defender makes some of those kind of comments?
No, I don't think there was anything wrong with the comments I made. The comments I made were truthful. What I said was, and I'm paraphrasing, when Israel receives $4 billion a year in foreign aid, Israel is a rich country, it does not need foreign aid. The only reason they receive the foreign aid is because of the mafia-style backhanded politics that they engage in. Now, regardless of that, and speaking of anti-Semitism, Jews have been characterized as sleazy, as thieves, as money-loving, and so forth. Now, of course, this is a racist slur. At the same time, it exists. This is exactly what the state of Israel is doing. It is behaving in a sleazy manner when it is demanding this money from the United States. They don't need the money, they don't deserve the money. So are they being sleazy? Absolutely. And they are behaving like sleazy thieves? Absolutely. That doesn't mean that I'm not saying Jews are sleazy thieves. I'm saying there's this reputation and now Israel is behaving in that way.
Mika Peled, thank you very much for joining us on Siyasi World.
The Palestinian Mandate, from its beginning, was a struggle between the Jewish community and the Arab community over land and population. The Zionists understood that if they were going to turn the promise of a national home into an independent state, they had to get Jews to come in from around the world to Palestine. And then they also had to get as much land as they could. Population was the first major battleground, the demographics of Palestine. If we go back to the 1850s, before the rise of Jewish nationalism in Europe, there were about 5% Jews living in what is today Palestine. The rest were Muslim Palestinians, and about 10% were Christian Palestinians. The struggle for land began with the rise of Zionism and the attempt to encourage Jews to move to Palestine. By World War I, 1914, about 14% of the population of Palestine was Jewish.
The United States was the first country to recognize the State of Israel in 1948, laying the foundations for an historic alliance based on the shared values of democracy, freedom, and human rights. The U.S. is more popular in Israel than in almost any other country in the world. Israel has been a geostrategic asset for the United States and America's most stable and reliable friend in the Middle East.
What What I'm about to show you is going to make your stomach churn, like it did mine. Representative Ilhan Omar is under fire for telling the truth. People are claiming that she's an anti-Semite because of some comments she made about a pro-Israel lobby, a very powerful pro-Israel lobby that spends gobs and gobs of money on Congress in order to make sure that they get their pro-Israel agenda through. And she told the truth about them and now is completely under fire. So what happened was Representative Kevin McCarthy, he basically threatened congressional action against Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib for criticism of Israel. When Ilhan Omar saw this and heard about what Representative Kevin McCarthy was saying, she tweeted a response quoting Puff Daddy, saying, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." Then the editor at The Forward, which is a Jewish publication, asked Omar who she was referring to as who she was insinuating was paying off these Republican congresspeople. And she responded, AIPAC, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is the United States' most prominent pro-Israel lobby. The Electronic Intifada actually got a hold of the film and released this 4-part documentary series. And you have to watch it. It will make your stomach churn. What I did was I took clips from the series and I condensed it down into a 4-minute piece. So I'm going to show the 4-minute kind of clips that I compiled for you. And this kind of gives you an idea of what Ilhan Omar was talking about. Here it is.
To get elected in the American political system, you need lots of money. What AIPAC does is it makes sure that money is funneled your way if you're seen as pro-Israel, and it'll go to significant lengths to make sure that you stay in office if you continue to be staunchly pro-Israel.
And on behalf of Congress, thank you for sending a clear and unequivocal message to the world that the United States stands with Israel now, tomorrow, and always.
I reject the BDS movement, whether it be on campuses in France and London or right here in the United States of America.
May God bless Israel. May God bless the United States of America. May God bless you all. Thank you so much. Thank you.
If you get AIPAC support, then more often than not, you're going to win.
Congressmen and senators don't do anything unless you pressure them. They kick the can down the road unless you pressure them. And the only way to do that is with money.
Right now, our current contribution limit from any person to a candidate is $2,700. Now, that's a lot of money, you know, and that can certainly buy some gratitude with the lawmaker. But if you really want to add punch to that type of buying of favors, what you do is you get 50 or 100 people together at an event like this, all chipping in $2,700, and then you bundle it all together and hand over the total amount to the lawmaker. At that point, we're talking anywhere up to $250,000. So suddenly you've got a group of people with the same demand they want from the lawmaker handing over $250,000. That buys a lawmaker.
If you wander off the reservation and you become critical of Israel, you not only will not get money, AIPAC will go to great lengths to find somebody to run against you and support that person very generously. And the end result is you're likely to lose your seat in Congress.
Democrats for failing to take tougher action against Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's anti-Semitic remarks.
The Democrats have become an anti-Israel party. They've become an anti-Jewish party.
And a group of Jewish millennials called Jexodus agrees. They are encouraging Jewish Americans to walk away from the Democratic Party.
The group says, quote, "We reject the hypocrisy, anti-Americanism, and anti-Semitism of the rising far left. Progressive Democrats and far too many old-school Jewish organizations take our support for granted." Here with more on the movement is former Trump campaign staffer and Jexodus spokesperson, Elizabeth Pipko. Elizabeth, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start at the beginning. Jexodus means what?
Obviously, it's a play on Exodus, but we left Egypt and now we're leaving the Democratic Party.
Why did you decide to do this and start this movement?
I thought it was time. Obviously, we saw a lot of anti-Israel policies kind of start under the Obama administration, and it got worse and worse, and clearly we've seen it. It's been plastered on our TV screens the last month. There's anti-Semitism in the Democratic Party. They can hide it. They can do whatever they want. They failed to condemn it, and now it's there, so it's time.
Elizabeth, how much does this hurt the Democratic Party, the fact that it sounded like we were going to have a resolution voted on in the floor, non-binding, perhaps with Congresswoman Omar's name on it, and then at the 11th hour, because of all the pressure from the party's left, they wound up not naming her, and it was not about anti-Semitism, it was just generally about hate across the board.
I mean, the scariest part, obviously, was not the original anti-Semitism. It was the lack of leadership coming into play when they were supposed to come into play, condemn what happened, and they failed.
Mm-hmm.
So not only did the anti-Semitism that started with Ilhan Omar get worse and worse, you know, by proving that she had supporters in her own party, but when the leadership fails to condemn that, it shows that they are a party of anti-Semitism. You know, the president said it the other day. That's what's happening, and they can't deny it.
Growing number of 2020 Democratic hopefuls will not attend this year's American Israel Public Affairs Committee Policy Conference.
An unprecedented shift is happening in U.S. electoral politics. Almost none of the currently declared 2020 presidential candidates from the Democratic Party appeared at the American Israel Public Affairs Committee's annual national conference, including Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Beto O'Rourke. AIPAC describes itself as a, quote, bipartisan organization of U.S. citizens committed solely to strengthening, protecting, and promoting the U.S.-Israel relationship. But its critics claim that AIPAC has gotten in the way of effective U.S. political and economic involvement in the Middle East, and created a culture in Washington that casts suspicion on anyone who hesitates to pledge support for an Israeli state that continues to carry out systematic war crimes against Palestinians. Recently, the progressive U.S. advocacy group Move On called on 2020 candidates to boycott AIPAC's conference, accusing the organization of spending millions to try and sabotage President Obama's 2015 Iran deal, mainstreaming anti-Muslim racism, giving platform to human rights abusers like Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and refusing to condemn the anti-Semitism of the Trump administration. Until now, AIPAC has enjoyed bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans.
Well, hello, AIPAC!
The founding of the State of Israel was one of the greatest political achievements of the 20th century.
And we will always reject the notion that Zionism is racism.
Appearing at the conference to pledge loyalty to both AIPAC and Israel has been standard operating procedure for representatives from both major parties for decades.
President Trump and I couldn't be more proud to stand with all of you, today, tomorrow, and always, to strengthen the ties that bind America and Israel.
But following Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's widely publicized criticism of Israel, a debate has erupted over the group's influence on U.S. politics and its ability to shape American support for Israel by funneling money into political campaigns.
Israel can saturate the media with its spokespeople, but there's still the problem
of massive Palestinian casualties showing up on television screens. You can't make those images go away. An Israeli official actually said, in the war of pictures we lose, so you need to correct, explain, or balance it in other ways. Here again, the Luntz document spells out which talking points have been most effective in spinning the brutal reality of Palestinian casualties. He says the first thing the pro-Israeli spokespeople should do is to express empathy for the innocent victims.
Unfortunately, innocents do get hurt, and we really grieve that.
We're sad for every civilian casualty.
The entire situation is tragic.
Once you've done that, Luntz says, you also have to get people to empathize with Israelis by describing what life is like for them, living in constant fear of Hamas rocket attacks. So again and again, we hear the focused, tested phrase that the rockets are raining down on Israel.
We have thousands of rockets raining down on our civilians.
Rockets were raining down on Israel.
Any advertising executive will tell you the essence of propaganda is repetition.
Rockets raining down on southern Israel.
Rockets raining down on Israel.
Well, Hamas rockets rain down on Israeli border towns.
Then Luntz tells PR spokespeople to turn the tables and ask the American people, what would you do?
So what would you do in the United States?
Can you imagine what America would do if it were facing a similar threat?
We always try to ask you the question we ask ourselves. What will you do?
What would you do?
What would you do if more than 3,000 rockets had been fired on your cities?
What would you do? 3,000 rockets.
What would you do if terrorists were tunneling under your frontier?
What would you do if 3 kids are kidnapped because of a tunnel network?
What sort of question is this? Of course, anybody would act to defend themselves against unprovoked aggression, but it is a question that is completely devoid of any context. What drives a society to a point where after multiple devastating wars, they continue to resist with these most feeble methods? They don't want you to ask that question. They don't want you to ask what is behind this. What's the history here? Who are these people? Where did they come from? Why are they so desperate? No, they want you to understand Israeli behavior. Israeli behavior is always characterized as a reaction to unprovoked violence.
The lesson is that this conflict started when we say it started, and we say it started when Israel was attacked.
Then on top of that, when massive numbers of Palestinian civilians predictably die from Israeli attacks, Israel claims it's part of a deliberate Hamas strategy to drum up sympathy.
They use telegenically dead Palestinians for their cause. They want the more dead, the better.
So they end up in this upside-down Orwellian world where Israelis killing civilians becomes an unforgivable transgression against Israelis.
It is hard to come away with any feeling but that we are in the midst of a world gone mad. Last week, I found a quote of many years ago by Golda Meir, one of Israel's early leaders, which might have been said yesterday. We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children, she said, but we can never forgive them for forcing us to kill their children.
It's not difficult to imagine Americans identifying with Palestinians who are suffering, but they need to be able to see that suffering on their television screens and in their newspapers.
Israel said today its new offensive is targeting terrorists.
And when your sense of the coverage is that there's something that these people did to deserve this, or that they are affiliated with terrorists and terrorist-minded governments, the fallout of that is an inability to identify with people who are suffering in far greater numbers and in far greater proportion than their Israeli counterparts.
Muslim doctor. She says Congresswoman Omar is an embarrassment and a disgrace to the Muslim community. Joining me now is Dr. Kanta Ahmed, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a counselor at the USC Shoah Foundation. Doctor, you also say that Omar is not the victim she portrays herself to be. Great to have you on. Why is that?
It's just diabolical that she commits yet another violence against the families of survivors of 9/11 and the families of victims of 9/11. Foremost, I'm a physician who takes care of people that have survived or had diseases complicated by the World Trade Center attacks. That was devastating remarks that I actually heard while I was in Africa, in Rwanda, commemorating a genocide there. She is depicting in this diminishment what I would describe as a profound denial of 9/11. And as you know, I work a lot with anti-Semitism, and it reminds me of the mentality of Holocaust deniers, or, as we've seen in Rwanda, there are some who would deny the genocide there too. So this denial raises in me a couple of questions. Does she really think 9/11 was not an Islamist, jihadist attack which came from within the Muslim fold? The Quran tells us, Islam tells us, we must be strict in observing justice, even if it means bearing witness against ourselves, against our kith and our kin. And it also tells us we have to do that with impartiality. We cannot be biased if we have certain prejudices. She harbors prejudices. She diminished the worst attack on this country since Pearl Harbor, and she does an assault on my patients, on all families who are grieving for their survivors. It's despicable. Worse is that opponents, whether in her party or not, are shielding her from the kind of searing criticism she deserves.
Well, Dr. Ahmed, we're going to have an entire hour on just this conversation of Islam in the world today, especially its role in America. And this conversation should focus on the facts. You just laid out a whole bunch of them. We really appreciate your being with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. And if I can just say, this observation of denying 9/11 was made to me when we discussed this in Rwanda with Muslims, with African Muslims.
We're going to keep this conversation going.
The problem was convincing European Jews to come to Palestine. Most didn't want to. It was a land filled with malaria, with Arabs, and a hostile climate. Most European Jews wanted to come to the United States or the Americas. In many ways, New York was the Jerusalem of European Jewry. Between 1880 and the First World War, about 2 million Jews left Europe for the United States. That began to change with a bunch of laws passed in the United States in the 1920s that limited migration. Jews began to look for a way to go to Palestine, to get out of Europe, and many chose going to Palestine. This particularly happened with the rise of Hitler. Without the rise of Hitler in Europe and Nazism and growing anti-Semitism, which culminated in the Holocaust, it's very possible that Jews would have remained there and not been attracted to the Zionist dream. We can see in the growth of Jewish immigration to Palestine the effects of the rise of Hitler in Europe. Immigration begins to really take off in 1933 when Hitler comes to power in Europe. The Jewish population of Palestine, which is at about 113,000 in 1931, jumps up to 650,000 by 1948. And that's largely due to the rise of Hitler.
Tonight, I'm obsessed with memory. Today marks Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we were struck by a new survey indicating that memories of the Holocaust are fading here in the United States. 70% of adults polled said fewer people seem to care about the Holocaust as much as they used to. More alarming, perhaps, was that 11% of adults and 22% of millennials either haven't heard or aren't sure they've heard of the Holocaust. That last number exposes a particularly troubling trend. Knowledge of the Holocaust among younger Americans is particularly weak. For instance, fully 66% of millennials were unable to identify Auschwitz. That's the Nazi death camp in Poland. The good news in this survey is that this memory loss is reversible, perhaps. 93% of those surveyed say that all students should learn about the Holocaust in school. But teaching about the Holocaust doesn't have to be limited to schools. If you're in Washington, D.C., take your child or children to the United States Holocaust Museum. Or you could simply rent a movie, like Schindler's List, or Sophie's Choice, or Life is Beautiful, or read a book like The Diary of Anne Frank. The number of Holocaust survivors worldwide is estimated at 400,000, and before long, we won't be able to ask them face-to-face what happened. No first-hand accounts. So teach your children, Learn for yourself, and now you understand, though, why this phrase matters more than any other when it comes to the Holocaust. Never forget.